Get started, I want to introduce you to Tony. If you don't know him, but I think he has lots of friends in the audience, so that's wonderful. Thank you all for being here. I don't know if you know this, he's also going to be honored tomorrow.
Tonight.
Oh, tonight.
And tomorrow. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tonight
2 times. Yeah.
A 2-time winner. So we're very thankful that he's taken the time to do this talk in all of his award-winning moments that he's having. So Tony Shechel received his BA in '86 and his MA in '89 at John Carroll University before completing a PhD in American Literature at the University of South Carolina. He is Professor of English and Director of the Race and Ethnic Studies program at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he teaches courses in American literature, poetry, and Southern literature and culture. He is the author of Racial Politics and Robert Penn Warren's Poetry, which received a Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award, and the Southern Hospitality Myth, Ethics, Politics, Race, and American Memory, which you see up there. He is currently at work on the Routledge Introduction to the Literature of the American South, which will be published in Routledge's Introduction to American Literature series. So without further ado, welcome Tony, and
thank you. Thanks. Thank you all. It's very nice to be here. And I do want to thank the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and University Relations and the Alumni Office, who I know all had a role in this, but it's also especially nice for me to be part of this Voices of Inclusion series. It's something that's very important to me, and it's my work and my teaching over the past 25 years. I do Southern literature, and basically the entire course, every class, you're talking about race, and you're talking about race and American culture. And I teach, like right now, I'm teaching a seminar on Toni Morrison. So same thing. It's like you don't do anything else in there. So and all my writing has really been, on race and in American culture and the history of it. And I think, it's something that it's not just an academic interest. It's like I've learned a lot about myself and my own history in doing the research. And so I know that, studying literature and starting here studying literature kind of changed the way I thought about a lot of things, and I grew a lot. And so I feel lucky to be somebody who is surrounded by young people, in my workplace, and I get to exchange ideas with them, and I learn a lot from them. I probably learn a lot more from them than they do from me. So, but I really appreciate being here. It's an exciting weekend for me, and to tell you the truth, this is a little nicer for me than the Athletic Hall of Fame, right? So no offense to the Athletic Hall of Fame, but this has been more of my life, right, for the past 30 years. So again, I'm going to be talking about my book, The Southern Hospitality Myth. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how I came to write this, how I got interested in the topic and the way I went. And even though I'm an English professor, it's not like a literary study. It's much more of a cultural study. It's kind of a cultural history. And so I want to, kind of go over how I got into this. And then I'm going to be showing a lot of images. And I'm going to be talking off of notes. There are going to be a few parts where I'm going to be reading a little bit more because it's kind of getting into something a little more complicated that I can't remember off the top of my head, and it'd be easier to read. So I'll go ahead and start now. So the idea for this book project came out of a classroom, and I had just finished my first book on Robert Penn Warren, Southern author of All the King's Men, and I was teaching a Southern Lit class for the first time at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and given that I was in Massachusetts, on the opening day of class, I had students just free write. I said, okay, write down everything that comes to mind when you think of the South. And so you got the whole list of everything from like NASCAR to Confederate flags to debutantes and country music. The only thing that all 25 students had in common was the phrase Southern hospitality. And I remember just being struck by that, and I asked them, well, what do you mean by that? What do we mean by that? And not a lot of them, most of them had never been to the South, and they couldn't explain. Well, I just know about it. They couldn't name what it was, though. So I immediately kind of, my first inclination was like, this has to be all about slavery, right? I mean, that was literally my first inclination. There has to be something behind this. So I didn't really know much about it at the time. And interestingly enough, I started to do some reading about it just to see where this came from and what sort of scholarship there was on it. And interestingly enough, I found a social scientist at University of North Carolina would do these annual Southern focus polls, which tried to kind of define different aspects of and perceptions of Southern culture. And so a 1995 focus poll asked 1,500 Americans, Southerners and non-Southerners alike, how important is Southern hospitality to your definition of today's South? This was the only question where Northern or non-Southern and Southern response was basically the same. So 73% Northerners, very important, 17.8, somewhat important, 67, and 21. That's 91% of Southerners, 88% of non-Southerners. So I was like, wow, that's just strange. There's something here. And so I initially started turning to reading a lot of history. And historians of the South, they point to a few different things. First of all, they account for Southern hospitality based on circumstantial factors in the old antebellum South, such as the large distances between plantations. So if you went to visit somebody, you were likely to stay overnight, and sometimes for long stays. They had this sort of open house tradition. Also, there was a lack of public inns, so people traveling would often have to stay with plantation owners, and they would sometimes pay for that. And then there was also a relative lack of public welfare, unlike in the North or in New England. So all these things put more pressure on the plantation home. It's also been seen and interpreted as a symptomatic expression of the Southern Code of Honor. Honor was very important among the plantation, the Southern slave owners. And you've heard of dueling. Dueling is all about saving face. As Kenneth Greenberg, the historian, says, Southern slave owners were, quote, superficial. What mattered most to them was the surface appearance of things. They had to appear in control. It was a culture based on gift exchange, that created bonds among the planters. But each gift could be looked at with suspicion. It was kind of competitive, and so hospitality was the same way. It was a way of showing your sense of mastery, showing, and this is why also plantation homes have the huge edifice, the long drives. It was seen as an extension of the person himself. And so hospitality was an important factor in that. And then finally, Marxist historians just, they interpret it as evidence of conspicuous consumption and competition that developed among the planter class. But the one thing that was interesting is I did all this reading, and you see all these historians explaining, well, where does Southern hospitality come from? What was it, or what is it? But nobody talked about anything after the antebellum, after the Civil War. It was all about the antebellum period. So what I became interested in is, well, why do we still talk about it away? How do you get from, slavery, where this is an actual, social practice, among the planters, through Civil War, Reconstruction, segregation, a history of white terrorism, and then eventually the Civil Rights Movement, and we still recognize Southern hospitality today, with all that cultural change. So this is kind of what I became interested in, this sort of untold story. And I initially thought this would, when I first started, I thought it was going to be a literary studies project. If any of you have read Faulkner, Absalom, the whole, the defining moment of the novel is the main character being turned away from a plantation home. He's a poor white kid, and he's turned away by a slave who's dressed better than him. And this just sets him on this mission to be like one of the plantation owners. So I thought it was going to be more of a literary studies project, but it turned out to be something different over a period of about 10 years. Two things happened. I started to become interested in what was the ubiquitous cultural presence of this discourse, and I realized that just talking about the literature couldn't get at what I really became more and more interested in. So in the finished book, and the finished book spans the period from 1820 up to the present, I consider travel writing, fiction, poetry, conduct, etiquette books, sermons, political speeches, editorials, congressional debates, travel and tourism books, advertisements, song lyrics, lifestyle magazines, cookbooks, and film, among other things. So it's very diverse. The second thing that really kind of set me on this path was in literary studies, you often think, you borrow from theory, philosophy and literary theory as a way to kind of frame your thinking about a project. And the thing that was very foundational for me with this book is I started reading the French philosopher, one of the founders of deconstruction, if you've heard of that. He really became, late in his career, he became very interested in the concept of hospitality. And Derrida, according to Derrida, hospitality is not one ethic among many. He says that hospitality is the ethic par excellence, the ethic above all other ethics. It's the most basic principle of the relationship between myself and another person, right? And so Jacques Derrida, though, he describes hospitality as a paradoxical law, which defines the sometimes ungraspable differences between the foreigner and the absolute other, the person who can be welcomed conditionally and the person who can never be welcomed. The word hospitality actually contains a self-contradiction. Hospitality and hostility come from the same Latin origin, hostis, which could mean variously stranger, foreigner, alien, guest, or enemy. So Derrida's point is that hospitality kind of carries this self-contradiction within it. And what he does is he goes on in deconstructing this. He distinguishes between the absolute ethic of hospitality, which demands welcoming of all equally. With absolute hospitality, there are no doors. Right, but he contrasts that with the politics of hospitality, which is all about defining who belongs and, more importantly, who doesn't. As soon as you have a door, you don't have hospitality. So hospitality becomes the door itself, according to Derrida. And so it's like, oh, why is hospitality so important in the South, where you would think, slavery, segregation, why do we associate this positive, attribute with this culture? So I have a quote here. I love this quote by Derrida. He says, this is the pure, unconditional, or infinite hospitality cannot and must not be anything else but an acceptance of risk. If I am sure that the newcomer that I welcome is perfectly harmless, innocent, that he or she will be beneficial to me, it is not hospitality. When I open my door, I must be ready to take the greatest of risks. And if you think about that, there are very few things I can think about that exemplify that. One incident that's fairly recent, is the massacre at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where a prayer group, a strange young white man showed up, and they invited him in. And some of these were older African Americans who grew up under segregation and who grew up knowing to be suspicious of strange white people. right, that they don't know. And yet they let him in. They allowed him to pray with him for a period of time until he massacred them. So I think that exemplifies this idea, you know. But what we talk about as hospitality is usually the politics of hospitality. So I want to switch and just start showing some slides here. I'm going to run through some of these quickly because, as I said, as I got into this, it's just ballooned. It was like, you know, I don't know. Anytime I told people I was working on this project, the first thing would people say, they would either say, that's just a lie, or it's like, yeah, it is so true. You know, I've been down south, and I would have to say, wait, I'm not doing that kind of book. You know, it's like, it's a little bit different from what you think. But I also just had people, you know, telling me, oh, you should look at this, you should look at that. So it just kept growing and growing. So how has the Southern hospitality myth been used? Advertising, marketing, you know, oftentimes over its history, especially after the Civil War, it kind of is transformed to like the American marketplace. And this is a very common strategy with the way we think of Southern hospitality is, you know, a way to link the past to the present, as though the South has this unchanging tradition, an unchanging culture. In addition to being used for advertising, it's also a commodity itself. On this page, all of these products are named Southern Hospitality or from so there you can buy Southern Hospitality as an ice cream flavor, a bourbon brand, an air freshener, a cocktail syrup, bath soap, foot soak, heel balm, candle brand, and a candle scent from a different manufacturer, a flavor of tea, a barbecue seasoning, of course, a Christmas ornament, a furniture brand, a coffee brand, and a men's grooming products company. And this took me about 15 minutes to put this together. I could have spent several hours and had a more exhaustive list. It's also made its way through popular culture in a variety of ways. So I just want to run through some images here. Music. We have here a couple of late 19th and early 20th century songbooks, song lyrics of popular songs titled Southern Hospitality or That Southern Hospitality. You can see kind of the racial dimensions here. This is kind of playing on the cakewalk tradition, which is kind of tied somewhat to minstrelsy in the South. It's a, you know, complicated cultural form, but the racial representations here are not positive, right? They are kind of drawn from images of minstrelsy. And here you see the guest being welcomed into the home with two black servants carrying the bags in. And then you also have these other, you know, Ludacris. Some of you know the rapper Ludacris. He had a hit song and video, Southern Hospitality. There's a Christian heavy metal band who has an album called Southern Hospitality, and they're on a Southern Hospitality too, and that's jazz singer Jerry Southern. Comic books. Vault of Horror from 1951 has a story titled Southern Hospitality, as does Donald Duck in 1952. This is a popular novel by a murder mystery by the author Leslie Ford, and obviously popular because it went through several different, you know, editions. Film, in this case, this is a classic it is one of the first so-called splatter films, kind of body horror from 1964. 1964, it's called 2000 Maniacs, and the premise of the film, this is actually the chapter that I'm probably most proud of because I'm cited as an authority on this film. And what's really interesting about this is the film's premise is these northern tourists they're traveling south to Florida, and they get led off of a detour to this small southern town that is celebrating this centennial. No, they don't know what the centennial is, and at the beginning they say, you're going to be our guests of honor. You're our guests. Of our southern. You're going to experience Southern hospitality, and the whole crowd. There's like knowing laughter. And so the crowds there, the Northerners there, I guess, and one by one, they're killed, they're murdered. And the thing that's interesting is they're murdered in ways that are not unlike the lynch carnivals, where the black victim, traditional black victim, is replaced by these white Northern tourists. So think about when this is made. This is during the summer of Mississippi burning, when the 3 civil rights workers went missing. This was being shown in the South at drive-ins at that time. So it's just interesting to think about what the reaction would have been when there's all this resistance to civil rights and meddling from the outside. It was also shown in northern markets, but it is seen as like a cult classic. Not for the reason I'm talking about, but just for new cinematic gore. And it was actually, there was a remake of it done in 2001. I can't remember. It's 1963 or 1964. I think it's 1964.
Coincident with 100 years of the Civil War, too.
Yes, yeah. And that's the centennial. It turns out that these Southerners in the town are ghosts from a Civil War massacre. So they got the idea from the musical Brigadoon that they would come to life every 100 years. Also, a big thing here, this is kind of probably pretty obvious, but tourism. The Southern hospitality myth has been traded on, for over a century as a way to promote tourism. And one of the important things is tourism is the number one generator of revenue in the South today. It surpassed agriculture decades ago. So the Southern hospitality is kind of called upon over and over and over again. One of the interesting things to think about, though, is when does the tourism begin in the South? These efforts begin in the 1920s as American roadways become better. And it really develops from the 40s through the 60s. So Americans from around the country were flocking south to experience the South during segregation, right? And African Americans at the same time could not travel the same way. Have any of you heard of the Green Book? It's basically like a AAA guide for people having to worry about, segregation. And so one of the things, this is a good example of hospitality as well. If you look at the Green Book, in addition to having accommodations that will allow black customers, they have things called tourist houses. And they would have addresses and phone numbers. And these were houses of private individuals that would write to the Green Book and say, I'm willing to put up a traveler when they come to Charleston. And so this period when Charleston is reaching its peak as a tourist destination in the 1950s, I looked at some of those, and there is not a single hotel listed as open to African American travels. And so you had to rely only on tourist homes. And it's also important in the case of Charleston, I'm not sure, imagine some of you have been there, it's a beautiful city. It has a very problematic history. The historic district, when that was developed, there had been a significant African American community in the area. And once they named it a historic district, they essentially removed them, for gentrification. So it's kind of at odds with this idea of tourism and also this is kind of I always thought this was a great example of just how seriously this is taken. This is a trade group magazine for tourism and hotels and restaurants in the South. It's called the Southern Hospitality Magazine. It's based in Florida, but it's the whole Southeast. And they had this actual program where you could sign up to have your hotel certified as providing an authentic Southern hospitality experience. So I looked this thing up, and it's basically, you have to sign up, and it's a surveillance thing where they send someone, you don't know they're sending it, and they have this whole checklist. And the thing that's funny, it's all about how the hotel staff treat you. You know, are they friendly or not? And so many of the hotel staff are coming from third world countries. They're not Southerners. So it's kind of farming out Southern hospitality to this immigrant population that is poorly, you know, underpaid, you know, wage laborers. So there's a lot of contradictions here. And of course, cookbooks. You know, there are thousands of Southern cookbooks published even within the past 10 years, you know, and some of these things are community cookbooks, you know, from, you know, local societies. You know, some of them are celebrities like Paula Deen, right? These things, every single one of them has to mention Southern hospitality somehow, you know. And I read a lot of these, and I write about them in the book. Here's the interesting thing. Even though modern Southern cookbooks always talk about Southern hospitality, I also read the original 19th century Southern cookbooks, like a Carolina Housewife, a Virginia Housewife. They never mention hospitality. They do, however, discuss how to properly manage your slaves in the kitchen. Right? So this is something that is forgotten. So I want to go through a series of images here. And these are contemporary paintings. Some of them are better than others. This is not an art history class here. But all of these paintings have the same title, Southern Hospitality. They're artists, you know, that most of them live in the South. They paint these. You can buy them online at art print poster sites. A lot of Southern-oriented shops in the South will sell these. So I'm going to start here. I'll just run through these quickly, just to show you kind of the range. This first one is by an artist. Southern Living magazine. I'll come back to this. Actually, now I'll just say now. One thing about Southern Living magazine, if you recognize it, it's the most popular and successful regional magazine, and it's also one of the top magazines in the country in terms of, you know, revenues. It's ahead of Glamour and just behind Sports Illustrated and Cosmopolitan. That's how popular it is. It was the first issue of Southern Living magazine. Southern Living magazine, it's based in Birmingham, Alabama. The first issue came out in 1966. The Southern Living magazine was developed by another magazine, an agricultural magazine going back to the 1880s called The Progressive Farmer. The Progressive Farmer realized that the South was changing. Agriculture was becoming less and less important. People were moving to the suburbs, and Southern Living was meant to appeal to the Southern, those who dwelled in the suburbs. The Progressive Farmer and Southern Living magazine are based in Birmingham, Alabama. The idea for this first came up in a Progressive Farmer board meeting in 1963 in Birmingham. They decided they would launch this as just a section in the Progressive Farmer, and they decided that year also that they would eventually do a standalone magazine. 1963 Birmingham. That's Martin Luther King's Birmingham campaign. Martin Luther King letter from the Birmingham jail. That is Bull Connor, water cannon, dogs, these images that we see, right? It is also the year of the Birmingham church bombing that killed 3 young black girls. And these board meetings and decisions are being made in this context. And so one of the points here is that, Southern Living magazine was introduced at exactly the right time. As Southerners were going through what was, for many of them, the most traumatic moment of their lives, the loss of segregation as a culture, as one of the editors said, everybody was running down the South. We wanted to feel good about something, right? And there's, geez, I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, well, you get the idea. But, you know, Southern Living magazine was created, and its success relies on this denial of the past, right? This denial of the South's racial history. Now, this is an important cover. I actually saw, I had to get this one when I found it online. This is the original 1966 cover. This is a May 1973 cover that included a picture of an integrated picnic. There's a few black individuals on this side, or at least one or two, sitting around young people sitting around a blanket for a picnic. This resulted in 5,000 canceled subscriptions. Right. So people that live through this change, I mean, that is a traumatic change. And it could be traumatic in a variety of ways. It could, I mean, if you are a white person in the South living through the transition from segregation to integration, you would either feel a sense of rage and impotence or a sense of guilt, right? And this alleviates that. This sublimates that. If you lose your practice of lynchings, separate water fountains, separate lunch counters, if you lose all these things that signify your status, you could at least exaggerate these other traits, sublimating those desires for white supremacy, essentially. So I want to run through these images, though. I wanted to share that anecdote. This is, to go back to these paintings, this is the first of them here. Frank Tarpley, Southern Hospitality. The pineapple is always associated with hospitality in general. The story of that is in the colonial period in America, pineapples were very exotic, expensive things. They came from the West Indies. They were imported in. And to have one on your centerpiece, and even more importantly, if you could actually afford to serve them as food, it was a sign of treating your guests well and kind of your munificence. So much so that people would rent pineapples to put on their table, right? So that's the pineapple. This is a still life by an artist named, this is Fran DiGiacomo, still life, very elegant with magnolias. This is another still life by another artist named Sherry Newt. This is another still life by an artist named Frank Tarpley. A little bit more, mundane than the more elegant previous ones. All of these are called Southern hospitality. Here we shift from a still life to an interior space. And there's a sense of kind of casual elegance. You have throw pillows and wicker chairs with like Queen Anne furniture. And you notice over there, there's 2 full wine glasses ready to be enjoyed. Right? This next one, we get into more iconic kind of imagery. A plantation home with the long drive, big white pillars, traditional plantation home, and there are two chairs out in front, apparently for guests. Right. You'll notice down here, this is a banner. It has the artist name, the title, Southern Hospitality, Phoenix Art Group. And yes, that's Phoenix, Arizona. It's a gallery in Phoenix. So Phoenix, Arizona is selling Southern hospitality as well. This is, I can't remember who this is off the top of my head. This is an artist named Mick Williams. And this looks like a plantation porch. There's wicker chairs. These are palmettos. And again, there's 2 chairs there, like in many of the others. And then this painting is by an artist named Larry Dyke. And He also is famous for painting golf courses, like golf course holes, and you can kind of see there's almost like you may have seen those types of painting. You kind of see a little bit of an echo there. One thing I want to note is that all these paintings purport to represent Southern hospitality. But if we consider hospitality as an exchange that occurs between people, it's almost as if they can't imagine what hospitality looks like, right? There's no people in these pictures. I want to talk about this for a second. In contrast to that previous, where you're coming up the drive, looking at the view here is somewhat askance. We see the home not as a typical visitor might, approaching up the drive leading to the home, but from the side of the mansion, peering at it as from a distance through the trees and azaleas. Perhaps the perspective is that of a welcome guest out for a stroll among the plantation grounds. But it's also slightly voyeuristic, right? Kind of looking at it from the side. So maybe it's just, some predator or something. But I'd like to shift perspectives a little bit more dramatically. What happens if we imagine the viewpoint as that of a slave approaching the big house from the less stately slave quarters that would have surrounded the plantation home? After all, the historical frame for this image of the iconic plantation home is utterly ambiguous. When we view this painting, we might, on the one hand, imagine that we are looking at an antebellum mansion as it existed before the Civil War, or we might, on the other hand, imagine that the painting represents a Southern mansion in the contemporary moment that somehow survived the vicissitudes of history. In other words, associating Southern hospitality with this image of the plantation home raises important, though neglected, questions regarding Southern hospitality's work as a form of cultural memory. In memorializing Southern hospitality through an image such as this, what is it that we are actually choosing to remember, and what are we choosing to forget? Looking to the past, can we imagine ourselves as guests of a hospitality based on slave labor? For that matter, can an owner of slaves ever be said to be hospitable? So this is kind of the closest thing to my thesis is my book that I'm going to read. This gives you kind of the big part of the argument. So the Southern hospitality myth explores the cultural work that this discourse of Southern has performed in the national imaginary for the past 2 centuries. More specifically, I argue that the Southern hospitality myth has served as a master discourse about race in America, consistently encoding American racial ideologies in a regressive manner. Rather than promoting an ethics of universal welcome, the discourse of Southern hospitality has expressed a retrograde politics of exclusion. First against the backdrop of sectional strife, and later in the wake of fratricidal civil war, the Southern hospitality myth has been used to create and promote a sense of trans-regional white community, solidarity, and privilege. It has done so by naturalizing the racial hierarchies of slavery and segregation, and by consistently portraying Black Americans as either an invisible or absolutely other population, incapable of being assimilated into mainstream American culture. Historically considered, then, Southern hospitality has functioned as a white mythology, produced by whites, directed to a white audience, and invested in the project of maintaining white status and privilege. While the discourse of Southern hospitality has been constantly adapted to suit changing conditions and needs, the underlying racial meaning of this discourse has remained constant. While Southern hospitality has been an important vehicle for self-definition among Southerners over the past 2 centuries, it has simultaneously provided one of the main tropes through which non-Southerners have imagined the relationship with the region. Faced with real national conflicts and traumas associated with the South, slavery, secession, Civil War, Reconstruction, segregation, the terrorism of white supremacy, and the long struggle for civil rights, Americans have consistently relied on the discourse to help them connect, in their imaginations at least, the region to the nation and the South of the past to the South of the present. As a system of representation, Southern hospitality forms an axis point around which numerous perceptions of the South and Southern culture have revolved. Ideas of home and community, relations with outsiders and strangers, the sense of a distinct regional identity and regional pride, the image of agrarian lifestyle leisure, the rise of travel, tourism, and hospitality industries in the modern South, and social hierarchies of class, gender, and most subtly and yet most ubiquitously race. It has functioned as a free-floating nostalgic image, an effective commercial concept, and a consumable commodity. To Northerners faced with the pressures of industrialization and modernization after the Civil War, it provided a nostalgic image of a simpler, better time and a regional ideal upon which to hang the hopes of regional reconciliation following the Civil War. To Southerners, it consistently stood as an image of regional pride, exceptionalism, and superiority. To both Southerners and non-Southerners, the discourse has provided an adaptable means for imagining amicable and social relations between the region and the nation, even in the face of the injustices of slavery and segregation. Slavery and segregation are antithetical to ethics of hospitality, and yet Southern hospitality has been a basic assumption in the national imaginary for the past 2 centuries, something that just goes without saying. The persistence of this myth can be seen as a corollary of our nation's centuries-long failure to fulfill its original promise of an inclusive democratic republic. So I want to briefly introduce this one slide and kind of do a close reading of it. This image appeared in Life magazine in 1925. There was a special issue devoted to Dixie. It was all focused on the South. And the title of this is called That's Southern Hospitality. And the picture here you see like a Southern gentleman. He's got the mustache, the Colonel Sanders tie. And they seem to be looking out a window. And the guest who's arrived is looking over his shoulder. And the Southerner says to the guest, "I've given you, sir, the guest chambers overlooking where the mint bed used to be." There's a sense of nostalgia here. Right? There's a sense of loss, a sense of declension, what used to be, right? And the older generation speaking to the younger generation. The action in the foreground conveys a sense of reverence and longing for the idealized image of the Old South. But the third figure here in the cartoon, a black servant who appears to be dropping off the luggage and listening, overhearing this, he both complicates and at the same time confirms the meaning. The black servant appears to be dropping off the luggage and overhearing the words, seemingly unnoticed or at least unacknowledged by the 2 central figures. Despite his background role, the servant's presence truly confirms the picture's meaning. In the background service role, excluded and unacknowledged, he confirms the identity of the main figures, their social standing, their superiority, in short, their whiteness. In the historical social practices of antebellum Southern hospitality, the slave was perpetually present and perpetually excluded, both relied on for service and reviled for supposed racial inferiority. Thomas Jefferson at Monticello constructed this dumbwaiter system and dumbwaiter system for serving. The whole point was to hide the slave labor from his guests, that he didn't want to see it, although he was relying on it. And that's the kind of metaphor for the book. This constructed status as perpetual outsider has similarly been used to confirm the solidarity and superiority of white American identity and to consumers. I just want to show 2 more things here, and I'll just kind of talk through this quickly, and we can stop, and I can answer any questions you have. This is a Google Ngram. Google Books has been downloading, digitizing historical books, for a couple decades now. And so they have this thing you can do where you can look up terms, like you could look up World War I, the Great War, and you can trace when the Great War kind of goes out of favor for the term World War I. You type in Southern hospitality in this, and remember, the historians talking about Southern hospitality trace its origins back to the 1600s. Jamestown, the second generation, third generation. The phrase Southern hospitality does not appear in any books until the 18 teens and 20s. All these cases here are from a Sir Walter Scott novel that's set in Scotland, Rob Roy, right? It just happens to use the phrase. So the phrase Southern hospitality actually doesn't emerge in common parlance until the 1820s, 1830s. This is 1860 here, so around the Civil War. So you see this bump. Does this mean that Southerners were just suddenly more hospitable than before and we started talking about? No. This is the sectional crisis over slavery. And Southern hospitality becomes a sort of shorthand in propaganda to promote the South and to appeal to non-Southerners as well. You notice here a drop-off after the Civil War, Reconstruction makes sense, but it starts to grow and grow again, right? This peak here, about 1936 to 1940, kind of coming out of the Depression. What's going on there? Gone with the wind, right? Fascination with the South. You know, Gone with the Wind is a Depression fantasy. You know, a life without labor, a life of leisure. You know, and then it drops off again during the Civil Rights Movement. That makes sense, but then it starts rising consistently again today. I want to just show you. I'll end with this image here. This is something. This is an anti-slavery almanac from 1839, and I think, you know, one of the points I make in the book is we don't think of hospitality in the ways that people did in the 19th century. Hospitality was a central virtue and a central social habit. You look at etiquette books, they have chapter after chapter after chapter. One etiquette book I read has 12 chapters out of 20 devoted to rules for being either a guest or a host. Right. So this was essential, and there were competing values of hospitality in America. There was this aristocratic strain, and then there was this more Republican strain. But the abolitionists developed their own ideas of abolition hospitality around the fugitive slave law, which essentially made it illegal to offer hospitality to slave. It was one of the great debates about hospitality in American culture. But this is just an essential image here to me. And it reflects a lot of writing in anti-slavery literature. Southern arguments to stop the mouths of Northern guests. The Northern man goes south, sits at a table loaded from the slave's unpaid toil, who eats his cornbread in the sun, marries a slaveholder, finds out that slavery is a divine institution and defends it in Southern and Northern pulpits. So you have these two couples sitting at this table. You have these barefoot slaves serving them. Out the window, a naked slave being whipped and slaves toiling in the field, right? So that juxtaposition, that's what the abolitionists kept trying to do. We forget this today, right? We've erased that from our memory, right? So I think I will stop there. I think I've talked enough. I usually talk more than I should. So I have a lot of other, this is kind of, gives you a sense of kind of the range of the period. I go all the way up to the contemporary moment, and I do have a chapter on Southern living. I also have a chapter on Paula Deen and her fall from grace. Yeah, and there's a lot of it's in the antebellum period. I have a long chapter on the fugitive slave law, but also there were these black sailor laws, black seaman laws, where sailors from foreign countries, from any ship that came into a southern port, if they had black sailors, they would be put in prison while the ship was in port for fear that they would infect the slave population with ideas, you know, that would cause uprisings. And some of these slaves, some of these sailors ended up being sold into slavery if the ship's captain would not pay for the time in jail. So, yeah. Questions? Thanks. Yeah. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah. Oh, I hope you don't mind. I'm really having hearing problems, so I'm going to have to walk to you to hear.
So as Southern hospitality in the magazines was on the uprise in the 1920s to 40s among whites traveling down to see the South, At the same time, you've got the Great Migration.
Yeah.
So where African Americans are moving north for work. So whites coming down for recreation, blacks going up
Yeah.
north for work. Did blacks carry up any elements of Southern hospitality?
Well, I think one of the things that is an interesting story that's not a story told in my book is how does the black population figure in this myth, if it's this white exclusionary myth? And one thing to keep in mind is the term Southerner, through much of its history, did not include blacks. Southerner, if you said Southerner in 1950, you meant a white Southerner, right? And so the Great Migration north to Rust Belt cities, to New York, people fleeing segregation for opportunity, it's not until like around the Civil Rights Movement that blacks in the South and in the North as well start to kind of reappropriate the idea of Southern hospitality as part of their identity. And now you have a reverse migration of a lot of blacks whose ancestors went north during the Great Migration years are now returning south. The South, interestingly enough, today has more people that were born outside of the South than inside of the South. So this whole question of Southern identity is becoming more and more just performative. You just say something Southern. You purchase something Southern. It's a commodity. Yeah, but that's a great question. But I found, there's interesting evidence. I ran across, for example, a student debate at Howard University, a historically black HBCU. And they had a debate between Howard students from the North and Howard students from the South. And one of the debate topics was over Southern hospitality. And like the Southern Howard students were arguing that it was this authentic thing. But these were students who were born post-civil rights, so there is this change. But at the same time, David Duke, when there were boycotts on South Carolina tourism to try to force the state to take down the Confederate flag, boycotters would go to the South Carolina Welcome Centers. And think about it, that is a very specific attack on this idea of tourism. It's an attack on Southern hospitality. David Duke and his Euro organization at the time, they staged counter-protests, and they would have people literally there, some of them dressed in Confederate uniforms, holding up signs, "Welcome, we love you all, Southern hospitality." Right? Come stay with us, white people, right? So this thing it's everywhere, and it's used for all sorts of things, Yeah, hi.
Hi, Jean Farrick in the English department.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. What I have is more like a comment than a question, but when you were talking about Derrida, so much of what he formulates is from the perspective of the person who is conferring hospitality, right? The risk.
Yeah.
Like that, that the person who they allow in might be harmful to them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I was just thinking about, in some of the examples you gave, with the Northerners coming down and like, oh, we're going to treat you to Southern hospitality, and then they get murdered.
Yeah.
And I would imagine also to the black slaves, right, or even just black people who weren't enslaved people, at a later generation, how hospitality was really, the risk was the person entering in. Were you going to be accepted, or were you going to be killed? Do you have room in your...
Well, I think one of the things that Derrida does is, that guest-host relationship, traditionally it's the host is the master, the host controls the threshold. Derrida sees hospitality as a universal right, and he actually draws from Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant has this treatise on cosmopolitanism, and towards perpetual peace and world peace. And he said that, one of the laws of this, common globe must be, universal hospitality, is the rights, the right to be treated without hostility. That nobody has a right, since the earth is a sphere and we cannot disperse ourselves infinitely, nobody has more of a right to it than another. It's a philosophical ideal. But Derrida also points out, in French, the term for guest and host is the same word, hôte. It has a little, I think I remember that from reading him. But his whole idea is to raise the guest up to the same status. And he says that, and it's true, when we invite guests over, a lot of it's about us, right? We want to put on a good spread, we want to be a good host, we want to, show our lovely home, and there is always kind of a selfish quality to that, even as you're being a good guest, a good host, yeah.
Well, the story you told, the 2,000 maniacs or whatever,
Yeah.
I keep thinking of 10,000 maniacs. That grew.
Yeah, exactly.
It reminded me of isn't the film, what is it called, Get Out?
Yes, yeah.
So there's a very sort of interesting example, a kind of perversion of Southern culture.
Yeah, yeah.
Or maybe an exposure of it.
I think just to, that's expanded to just the question of race and class. To what extent does race intersect with class and people entering into, kind of worlds of privilege that they are not traditionally a part of, So I think it becomes kind of something similar and something dangerous, right? I like that movie. Yeah.
I was literally going to ask the question about that movie. Because I thought what was so interesting about that movie was the way in which it implicated the North in a way that we tend to sort of say, oh, this is just about the South.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked this question. This is something that's interesting about teaching Southern literature in Massachusetts, because that's the way students start the class. And Robert Penn Warren has, if you're interested in the Civil War and just the importance of the Civil War, Robert Penn Warren wrote this very small book. It's actually a long essay. It's called The Legacy of the Civil War, and he wrote it on the centennial, like in 1961, I think. And he's talking here about the psychological legacy of the war. And he has this one great insight. He offers two metaphors for what the psychological legacy is in both the South and the North. He said that the Civil War provided the South with the great alibi, he calls it. We were defeated. We can't change things. We're stuck, right? And a general resistance to change and a sense that this was forced upon us and we can't do anything about it. For those of us not in the South, what did it give us? The metaphor is the treasury of virtue, that we can pat ourselves on the back. We were the side that were morally right, and there's a tendency to always project, our ideas of racial injustice and say that these things occur elsewhere, and we, everything gets projected onto the South. The South plays a huge role in American culture and how we think about race and justice and history. And this is something that my students inevitably kind of come to at the end as they start talking more and more about the irony of the way we look at the South and as a way of avoiding. I live in Massachusetts and I ride my bike a lot. I'm a cyclist. And so I live in Lowell, Massachusetts with an old mill town, but I ride to some of the well-heeled suburbs outside. And you'll go to some of these very wealthy suburbs, and wealthy towns, and you'll see Black Lives Matter signs all over the place in these lily white towns. But you'll see some of them literally, and I took pictures of these, a Black Lives Matter sign right next to a sign opposing a public housing project, with no irony, right? And I think that's exactly what that is. And that is, in my view, a huge impediment to why we can never get out of just this long original sin of slavery. one of the things I always point out to my students, we think of the Mayflower, and the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Mayflower got here 1620, 1619, slaves first landed at Jamestown, and that's the whole point of the 1619 project, to put that at the center for a moment and just think, how does that affect us, and what is the legacy of that? So, and unfortunately now we're in a day of book banning again, and not just book banning, it's like you can't teach difficult things from history, because people are so fragile, Yeah, I know me.
So talk about your experience here at John Carroll University and how it has informed or influenced your interest in race and racism.
Yeah, well, I had a great experience here in many ways, and I want to talk about like my experience in English classes in a minute. But at the same time, one of the things that informs my experience, and it was important to me just in terms of how I got interested in what I'm interested in and what I work on, is John Carroll was one moment among many in my life where I was occasionally exposed to racist language, racist talk, right? It was not a diverse campus. It does not reflect the campus as a whole. But I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in the city at 6 Mile Road in the late 60s, early 70s. I was there as a young boy when white flight began. I saw that. And, I went to John Carroll, and just like in my high school, just like anywhere you go at that time, I think you would hear things. And, I was a silent bystander most of the time. I did talk back to friends sometimes, but, I think it's the way we are on social media now. If people say things in politics you just don't want to engage, you might unfriend them or shut them down, but you don't kind of engage them. So, but I will say, I do remember one formative moment. I'm very glad that Professor Lardy is here, and I still will call him Professor in public, although I called him David for the first time today. I hope you don't mind.
Yes, I do.
But I will say, I read Huck Finn in high school, and slavery was not discussed in that. And I read Huck Finn with Dr. LaGuardia, and you introduced me and the class to this whole thesis of American literature that the critic Leslie Fiedler wrote, a famous book called Love and Death in the American Novel. And he puts like American two things. It's about sex and race, and it's about American prudery and how that influences things, but also fear of blackness. But there's this pattern in classic American novels of two characters going off into the wilderness. One of them, this central white character, and he's always accompanied by a non-white character. Jim with Huck, Natty Bumppo with Queequeg, Ishmael with Queequeg, Natty Bumppo with Uncas, and my favorite, Arthur Gordon Pym with Dirk Peters. Yeah, and so I was like, and especially reading Arthur Gordon Pym, it becomes this crazy racial allegory. And I never thought of Edgar Allan Poe as a Southerner, but that book, you're like, wow, this is strange stuff. And in the closing chapters, he's describing the landscape, and there's this one line where he describes something looking like cotton bales, which is clearly he's drawing some kind of racial allegory, even though this is supposed to be taking place down in the Antarctic, And so I got, I started to see that things that you just see as like literary texts were embedded in something much bigger. When I finished grad school around 1992, 93, Toni Morrison wrote this really influential book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination. And reading that kind of, reminded me that I used to use your notes from your class. I still have those notebooks when I first started teaching American Lit surveys. But that I had done a dissertation on Warren, and I did not, like most critics who wrote on him, I did not engage his Southernness. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in him as a poet. But I realized that there was a story there. And after reading Toni Morrison, she basically said, we need more criticism on white consciousness, like how white people and how white authors play in the dark, as she says. What role does the fact of slavery and the fact of the black population in America, when you have like people like Whitman and Emerson Thoreau talking about the freedom of the individual, that's against the background of slavery. How does that play with the creative imagination? So my book on Warren was this kind of, he started his career as a segregationist. By the middle of the century, he became a public integrationist, he was doing books on integration, but he also was a poet throughout his career. And so what I became interested in is, how does his changing politics affect his changing poetics? How are these things linked? And his poetry does change dramatically. And in fact, at this time when he was rethinking and shifting toward an integrationist position, he had an impasse of 10 years where he could not write a poem, for some reason. So, but he came out. So it became, a book just about the relationship between race and aesthetics and poetry. But my English classes here were very important. It was Professor LaGuardia and Professor Magner were my two big influences on me, especially with American literature. I hope you're not British.
Tony,
Yeah.
you're kind of the white guy who went to high school in Detroit and college in Cleveland, and then went to the University of South Carolina for a PhD, so that the impact of the South upon your own psychology is interesting, since now you talk about the South as in your profession.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit. It seems as if the psyche of the South is an aspect of the whole issue of white supremacy. It seems to be coming north in recent times, and it's becoming a little bit more, very unsettling, it seems to me, in our current culture. So you have this interesting bifurcation of self between Northerner and Southerner, and becoming preoccupied with the South and all that implies. Yet making it your profession and teaching in Lowell, Massachusetts. Yeah,
and that is a part of it. The South, going south, I think that was really formative after living, in these Rust Belt cities, and which, Rust Belt cities have their own complicated racial histories, obviously, but going south in South Carolina, when I was down there, Confederate flag was on the State House, and I just thought that was just so bizarre, But I would drive around the state. I love South Carolina. I had a great experience there. It's beautiful. But things that are hidden here are stark there, and it causes you to reflect, and you. So I would say, yes, that was huge. And to tell you the truth, one of the reasons I got interested in Southern literature, and especially all of my research is really focused on race, most of my writing over the past 25 years was, it allows me to kind of navigate my own past, my own history, and how I fit into bigger cultural patterns and how things are changing. And I think literature, one of the great things about literature, and I always felt this here in classes I took, is it allowed you to think about complex things that affected you in a safe way. Because you're looking at something outside of yourself, but it still reflects yourself. And so when I teach Southern Lit in in South Carolina, there is this, or in Massachusetts, there is this process where students kind of come in, they're kind of projecting everything onto the South, and, you know, they start to realize, you know, more and more over the course of the semester. And one of the things I love about this class, and I've taught it a lot, is inevitably, like the last third of the class, you know, there will be a conversation about a text that will just go off the rails, you know, and suddenly we spend an entire hour not talking about that text, but we're talking about, you know, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, book banning, you know, Black immigrants versus African Americans, you know, just all sorts of stuff, you know, and White Lives Matter, just, and it is, I let it go. I hold on to the reins, but I think the thing that's great about it is even when students are disagreeing, I've had some real disagreements among students in that class, is they always treat each other with respect, and even though there are sometimes even arguments, at the end of class, it's like people have had a shared experience for 10 or 12 weeks by then, you know, and they realize these are complicated topics. And they've been talking about them for 10 weeks. And so the literature classroom for me becomes a way for my students to get the same thing I got out of literature, which was, you know, better self-understanding of how, you know, I mean, to tell you the truth, my own complicity historically. And you know, I think that's important.
Well, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Tony, and thank you all again for being here. I know he'll stick around for a couple of minutes if you have more questions.
Yeah, happy to
If
talk.
there's more food, please feel free to grab some more food. But this concludes the formal program, and thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.